Good morning and welcome to today's meeting of the CFTC's Agricultural Advisory Committee. As the designated federal officer, I hereby call this meeting to order. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Chairman Benham and Commissioner Goldsmith Romero and thank them for joining today's meeting. Thank you to all the members of the committee and the guest speakers for their time today. To begin the meeting, we are pleased to first recognize Chairman Benham for his opening remarks, followed by the commissioners. Chairman Benham.
Swati, thank you so much, and welcome everyone on a humid day here in Washington. A few things, I'll be brief. Do want to thank my fellow commissioners, Commissioner Mercinger and Goldsmith Romero for being here, and I know we're going to hear from some others as well. Special thanks to Swati and Scott. I know you guys have been engaged with them over the past couple months. We've had a good year so far. We had the meeting a few months ago, and here we are again, and it's a big day. As I said earlier, we got to get comfortable because we're going to have the voluntary carbon markets meeting later, and this was very intentional. We wanted you guys here to be a part of the conversation. There was some debate whether or not we split up the two meetings, but given your role and I think the interest we've seen from the committee in this emerging voluntary carbon markets discussion, I thought it was really important to have you all here to provide input to see what you're experiencing on the ground and how you can add value to that conversation. But before we get there, in the next hour and a half or so, we're going to have two very important conversations. One about access to markets. This is an issue that came up, I think, within the committee's deliberation a year ago or so when we thought about what issues we needed to discuss. I think this is, given the challenges we're facing, both geopolitical, climate, and just market conditions that are very volatile and very uncertain, ensuring that all of you have access to futures markets becomes that much more critical. And I think we've seen obviously concentration in the market over the past few decades. We've seen fewer points of access for smaller end users to the markets over the past few decades. And our goal would certainly be here today to start to investigate why we're seeing those trends, and if there's anything we can do collectively as both a regulator and commercial end users to reverse those trends so that you continue to have access. With all of these challenges we're facing, you need every tool in your toolbox to manage risk. In the futures markets, given their history and given the role the CFTC has played with respect to agriculture and production agriculture more specifically, ensuring that these markets are here for you becomes one of our biggest priorities, if not our number one priority. The number two issue we're going to discuss is the Mississippi. We also had a conversation about this. Obviously, a key artery for American agriculture and getting goods out of the Midwest to the Gulf and across the globe. We provide food and fiber to the rest of the world, and in ensuring we can continue to do that, we need to make sure our infrastructure, including our waterways, are working. And obviously there's a lot of variables and externalities that we can't control, most notably weather, but we can certainly do what we have in terms of authority and relationships with other agencies. We heard from the Maritime Commission a few months ago, and certainly would welcome the opportunity to work with other U.S. agencies, both at the federal level and the state and local level, to ensure that we're doing what we can to make sure that the Mississippi, to the extent we can control, is operating as needed so that goods can flow up and down as needed. So another important discussion tied to weather, tied to other critical issues we're facing today, but one that I'm looking forward to and certainly appreciate all of your contributions. And we'll have a great morning, hopefully a great afternoon, and we'll work from here and work towards the end of the year of having more discussions around issues that are important to you. And hopefully, as I've said before, my number one goal is to hear from you so that we can elevate challenges and issues that you're seeing back home, so that we can participate in them, contribute to them, and ultimately find solutions. That's the goal here, as always, and bringing everyone together, I think, is a first step in accomplishing those goals. So thanks again to everyone who participated. We've had a busy couple of days, if not weeks, at the CFTC. I do want to recognize all the staff that participated in putting these meetings together. It looks perfect. It takes a lot of time to make it right, and I do want to thank all of those behind the scenes who made today happen. So Swati, I'll hand it back to you. Again, thanks for all of the work that you've done to get us here today.
Thank you, Chairman Benham. Commissioner Goldsmith Romero?
Welcome. It's so nice to see everyone. I appreciate the chance that we could all be together in person. It's very nice. Look at your faces and hear from you. So thank you to all the members. Thank you to Swati. Thank you to Scott. Thank you to Chairman Benham for his leadership. I want to echo the chairman's remarks, which were I thought were spot on in terms of what our role is and what our goals are. I recently heard this quote at a Senate Ag hearing. That's really a great reminder. The typical person may occasionally need a doctor or an attorney once in a lifetime, but the same person 3 times a day, every single day, needs a farmer. And so over the last 3 years, U.S. farmers, ranchers, and producers have continued to meet that need 3 times a day, every single day. I say the last 3 years, it's obviously been longer, but the last 3 years have really had a lot of challenges with the pandemic, rising trade tensions with China, Russia's war in Ukraine, which all threatens the agricultural supply chain. And then, of course, it seems like one of the most persistent challenges for farmers, ranchers, and producers is the changing face of Mother Nature. We've got shifting weather patterns and more extreme weather threaten crops and livestock via hurricane, wildfire, drought, flooding, and they're making it more difficult to get these products to market. I'm very interested to hear about developments in the Mississippi River, barge traffic. Earlier in the summer, Commissioner Mersinger and I visited a grain elevator and producer near Kansas City. And there we saw and heard firsthand how historically low water levels in the Missouri River were affecting the ability to load barges and ship grain. And so when we were there, the producer pointed out the barge that had the number 4 painted on the side, which is not normally exposed. And the fact that it was visible was like a warning sign about low river levels. And so forecasts suggest that ongoing drought in the Midwest mean that the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers will reach sort of low stages by the end of July. And keeping grain barges moving is critical, as you know. The producer explained to us that what those low water levels meant was that the barges couldn't be filled up as much as normally. And so what they would do is they would sort of, maybe it's a half load of a barge, move the barge downriver to where it's a little bit deeper, but then they would have to truck the rest of the grain. And then they would have to find a place where they could load the grain into the barge. Extra steps mean extra costs. That can hurt producers and ultimately families who buy their dinner at the grocery store. Can also create delays, could cause missed delivery dates, a risk that end users have to manage. Unfortunately, drought isn't the only challenge for barge shipping. Rain and melting snowfall is a welcome sight, with much of the American corn and winter wheat belt suffering from drought this year. But then too much of it all at once can cause problems for shipping too. In April, there was this seesaw from the drought in the fall in the Mississippi River, and then record melting snowfall caused flooding and lock closures on upper Mississippi to most barge traffic for weeks. And this affected deliveries of grain and soybeans and fertilizer in advance of spring planting. The barges needed to be like offloaded and then transported by truck or rail. So these are the types of challenge that really drives home the importance of farmers and producers to access derivatives markets that are well functioning, that are orderly. When they work right, our markets can help them manage risk and obtain the certainty they need to make decisions for the coming year. So core to our role, the CFTC, as the chairman said, is to listen and hear what's working, what's not. And that's why this advisory committee is so important. I have my notepad, I have my pen, I am all ears, I'm listening. As I said at the time of my confirmation, my number one priority is to make sure our markets are working well. I will continue to visit with and listen to our end users and market participants to understand the challenges that you face, and then appropriate solutions, how we can help. I'm also, of course, looking forward to hearing from the panel on issues related to access to FCMs in our markets by small farmers and end users. So most importantly, thank you for your service. Very happy to be here and listen to what you have to say and for all you do to feed and clothe this country. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero. Commissioner Mersinger?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And thanks to the chairman for organizing today's Agriculture Advisory Committee meeting, as well as the voluntary carbon markets discussion that we'll have later this afternoon. So July in my household is a time for summer break, weekends at the pool, fireworks, and commemorating our nation's independence. We celebrate, we relax. Occasionally there's a disruption with an afternoon thunderstorm or maybe the inescapable yard work that comes with the season. But we just finished baseball, we just finished softball, and we have this short reprieve from the packed schedules that we normally have with school activities and sports. However, I found the only thing I have to do to kind of ruin that summertime bubble is to call home and talk to my father. And I'm always quickly reminded that the month of July was not always so fun and relaxing when I was growing up. So most recently, it was, I think, probably on Father's Day when I called home and talked to my dad. And I always say, how are things going? Weather always comes up. And the conversation felt like deja vu. Dad said, well, we're in the middle of a drought and we desperately need rain. He was worried about shortened growth cycles and crops drying out from the heat and wind before they reached maturity, threatening lower yields at best and leaving nothing to harvest at worst. So I gave him one of my typical responses to this conversation. Well, Dad, it's either a drought or a flood, right? And usually my dad will respond with more grumbling about his fields and crops and maybe next year will be better. But this time he said something a little different that surprised me. He said, no, it's really bad this year. And I know his conclusion was not based on science or data, but just on what he knows from farming for over 60 years. Now, after so many years working in Washington, I rarely take what someone tells me at face value and try to do a little more research on my own. So I did go to NOAA's drought monitor to kind of see how this drought compares to previous summers days that were always hot and dry and rain was never in the forecast. And according to the website, January through May of 2023, those months were recorded as the driest in the state of South Dakota in 129 years. So what I found out based on my quick research is Dad was right. It is really bad. But the impacts of dry conditions go far beyond crop health and yields. As we've heard from previous AAC meetings, and I believe we'll talk about again today, is that these effects are up and down the supply chain, with low water levels complicating barge traffic and movement of grain to various ports for exporting, decreasing available grazing land for livestock, placing higher demand on feedstock like corn. The overall agriculture economy feels these impacts, and we see the effects on the broader economy as well. That's why the derivatives markets we regulate at the CFTC are critical during times of economic hardship. And our job as regulators is to ensure those markets function well in their role of providing sound price discovery and hedging tools. And we can't do that job without understanding what is happening in the fields, pastures, and in our waterways. The updates and information from the experts before us today will help us fulfill that responsibility. So again, thank you to the chairman for holding today's meetings. Thank you to the panelists and the participants and committee members, and certainly all the staff for all your hard work in organizing today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Mersinger. We have Commissioner Pham joining us virtually.
Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Agricultural Advisory Committee. Thank you to Chairman Benham, Designated Federal Officer Swati Shah, and the rest of the CFTC staff that helped arrange this meeting. I would also like to thank the AAC members and speakers here today for your time and service. I often like to note that in the United States, and much like the birth of our country, agriculture is where this agency began. The CFTC connection to agriculture and the agenda we have today demonstrates the agency's grounding in the real economy and the importance of agricultural derivatives, just as my fellow commissioners have echoed. Having grown up in California's Central Valley, the food basket of the world, I know the vital role of the agricultural economy to the United States' overall GDP. Looking at the agenda, and just to make it personal, note, I want to highlight that the importance of the Colorado and Sacramento rivers to California's agricultural industry underscores the necessity of maintaining healthy riverways. Drought has historically had significant impact on California, often causing downstream agricultural disruption. For example, due to drought conditions in the region, pressure has been placed on California's farmers, ranchers, and producers to curtail water usage from the Colorado River. But California's agricultural output accounts for over a third of the country's vegetables and 3/4 of the country's fruits and nuts. Similarly, recurring drought conditions along the Mississippi River could impact the agricultural sector by drastically reducing shipping capacity due to lowered water levels. The Mississippi River moves 500 million tons of agricultural products annually, representing an average value of $130 billion in commodities per year. Considering the agricultural significance of the Mississippi River, drought-related shipping restrictions could impose substantial costs on the agricultural industry. I appreciate that the AAC is examining this issue because of its importance to the commodities markets. Supply chain and logistics disruptions impose significant burdens on the derivatives markets by increasing counterparty risk and premiums in the cash market. These effects can lead to larger volatility and surprise spread across the derivatives market. And considering current supply chain disruptions in rail and chassis methods of transportation, as we heard at the first GMAC meeting earlier in February, the preservation of the Mississippi River as a viable shipping channel is especially important. I also appreciate that the AAC is examining agricultural market participants' access to futures commission markets, merchants, and to our markets. Access to markets is one of my 3 core values as a commissioner, together with growth and progress. FCMs have traditionally cited challenges to the business model, considering high technology costs, high compliance costs, and increasing capital requirements, leading to a contraction in the FCM market of available clearing providers. In the past several years, certain FCMs are now subject to higher capital requirements for customer clearing due to the implementation of the Standardized Approach to Counterparty Credit Risk, or SACR, under Basel III. The SACR methodology may disincentivize firms from offering clearing services to end users by increasing capital charges disproportionately to the risk posed by the activity. All these increased pressures to the FCM business and operating model have likely contributed to the further concentration of clearing members in the United States. As the number of FCMs has continued to decline, fewer and fewer FCMs now hold more and more total margin. This continued development could pose problems for agricultural hedgers who have historically relied on a robust clearing ecosystem. Consolidation may pose systemic risk by amplifying the ramifications of the failure or withdrawal of a major provider. I look forward to hearing firsthand from market participants that are trying to run a business in this challenging environment, and I'm especially interested in hearing about any potential solutions. The health of the agricultural economy is critically important to all Americans. Thanks again to Chairman Benham, AAC members, and speakers. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham. Before we begin today's presentation, I want to remind all participants in today's meeting to please make sure to mute your microphone when you are not speaking. After each presentation today, there will be a dialogue segment where members of the committee, the chairman, and the commissioners will have an opportunity to provide comments or ask questions. If you would like to speak, please turn your name hat to the right. If you are joining virtually, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. When called upon, please identify yourself and the organization that you represent on the committee. Scott, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you now.
Thank you, Swati. And thank you, Chairman Benham, Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero, Commissioner Mercier, and Commissioner Pham. We want to make sure that these meetings are as relevant as possible to the members. And so in that spirit, please keep Swati and me posted of suggested topics for our next in-person meeting, tentatively scheduled for December 13th here in DC. I look forward to facilitating the discussion of members' perspectives to the AAC and working with AAC members to provide the Commission with feedback and recommendations that assist the agency in the oversight of our markets. To ensure that today's discussion is consistent with the AAC Charter, no determination of fact or policy shall be made by the AAC on behalf of the Commission. Determinations of action to be taken and policy to be expressed with respect to the reports and/or recommendations of the AAC shall be made solely by the Commission. So now, before we begin our first panel, we would like to do a roll call of the members and guest panelists so that we have your attendance on the record. Swati will lead the roll call.
Thank you, Scott. AAC members, after I say your name and organization, please indicate that you are present. If you're joining virtually, please make sure your phone is not muted. Buddy Allen, American Cotton Shippers Association.
Present.
Joe Barker, National Council of Farmer Cooperatives.
Present.
Chris Betts, Michigan Agribusiness Association.
Present.
Robbie Boone, Farm Credit Council.
Present.
Lane Carlson, Minneapolis Grain Exchange.
Present.
Robert Chesler, United Dairymen of Arizona. Jerry Corcoran, Futures Industry Association.
Present.
Patrick Coyle, National Grain and Feed Association.
Present.
Edward Elfman, American Bankers Association.
Present.
Edward Gallagher, National Milk Producers Federation.
Present.
Thomas Haig, National Corn Growers Association.
Present.
Thomas Hayden Jr., Commodity Markets Council.
Present.
Scott Herndon, Field to Market.
Present.
Thomas Hogan, Cocoa Merchants Association of America. Jared Hooker, American Soybean Association.
Present.
Brian Humphreys, National Pork Producers Council.
Present.
Willis Kidd, Citadel. Jeff Lloyd, Archer Daniels Midland.
Present.
Michelle Mapes, Green Plains, Inc.
Present.
Mark McHarg, American Farm Bureau Federation.
Present.
Aaron Morris, USDA. Dr. Cynthia Nickerson, USDA.
Present.
Edward Prosser, The Schooler Company. Michael Ricks, Cargill.
Present.
Bella Rosenberg, ISDA.
Present.
Derek Salmon, CME Group.
Present.
Troy Sander, National Cattlemen's Beef Association.
Present.
Liam Smith, Futures Industry Association, Principal Traders Group.
Present.
Liam, did you unmute?
Yes, present.
Okay. Stephen Strong, North American Export Grain Association. Kurt Strubar, Grain and Feed Association of Illinois.
Present.
Justin Tupper, U.S. Cattlemen's Association. Wes Allmeyer, Greenfield Holdings.
Present.
Hayden Wands, American Bakers Association.
Present.
Ryan Weston, American Sugar Alliance.
Present.
Jason Wheeler, USA Rice Federation.
Present.
Okay, and last but not least, our guest speaker, Susan Olson, Action Intel.
Present.
Thank you. I will now turn the meeting back over to Scott.
All right. Our panel today will provide a discussion on the role of FCMs in access to the futures markets. We will hear from Jerry Corcoran with FIA, Kurt Strubhar, Advanced Trading, Inc., and Lane Carlson with Minneapolis Grain Exchange. Jerry, if you're ready, please begin.
I am, and thank you. Chairman Benham, fellow members of the commission, thank you for the invitation to participate in an important discussion about the role that Futures Commission merchants play in providing farmers, grain merchants, and other agricultural companies with access to the futures markets. As you know, my name is Jerry Corcoran, as well as representing FIA. I am the chairman and the chief executive officer of R.J. O'Brien Associates. I've been around quite a while. I started in 1987, and as many of you know, R.J. O'Brien is ag-centric as an FCM. I'm proud to represent FIA on this important advisory committee. FIA's membership includes FCMs, exchanges, and clearinghouses, as well as commodity and user firms from the agricultural and energy space. that utilize futures markets to manage and hedge risk. I've served as a member of the FIA board for over 15 years. Today's farmers are not producing just for their local markets. The corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, and other commodities that they produce are exported all over the world. Knowing that they can rely on well-regulated futures and options markets gives American farmers the protection from price volatility that they need to compete in the global markets for these products. Let's talk about the FCM landscape a bit today. And first, a little background on FCMs. Futures commission merchants are an important partner of the agricultural end user community. They perform several critical functions in the trading and clearing life cycle on behalf of their customers. First, they offer customers a central point of access to futures exchanges and clearinghouses around the world. Second, they maintain an array of checks and controls aimed at protecting both the markets and customers from irresponsible behavior and illegal activities. Third, they're responsible for collecting margins from their clients, safeguarding these margins, and guaranteeing their clients' obligations to the marketplace. And finally, they contribute significant financial resources to the default funds maintained by clearinghouses. These default funds serve to absorb losses from defaults and protect the stability of the futures markets. Now let's look at some numbers. The number of firms providing these services is in decline. However, while there's 60 FCMs registered with the CFTC today, not all of them are actually providing clearing services to customers. If we narrow this down to the firms that actually hold customer funds, there are only 47 FCMs as of May 2023. Now compare this to 10 years earlier, and there were 68, and 10 years before that, there was 102. So you can see the rapid decline in FCM's participation. In fact, over the last 2 years, there's been roughly a 50% decline in the number of FCMs providing clearing services to customers. Now, there are many reasons for this decline in the number of FCMs. There's been mergers and acquisitions, the impact of the 2008 financial crisis, the cost of keeping up with technology, and the impact of capital requirements all have played roles in this decline. In addition, as far as new FCMs, there are several barriers to enter, most notably to start an FCM business from scratch with all the costs of connecting to exchanges and building necessary technology infrastructure is incredibly capital intensive. In short, a successful new FCM must have scale. Without scale, there's a lack of profitability and a lack of a return on capital that would interest an investor to form a new FCM. But with that said, I believe the existing FCM network is a strong one, and it's available to all participants and allow equal access to the marketplace for farmers and ranchers. There's another segment of the futures industry that goes unnoticed and unspoken about that plays a critical role in servicing small and medium-sized farmers and ranchers in this country, and that's the role of the introducing broker. While larger agricultural commodity firms generally directly interface with an FCM, smaller and mid-sized agricultural end users have tools at their disposal to connect to the global network from commodity exchanges. Introducing brokers are a valuable and effective part of the overall market and serve a critical role in connecting small and mid-sized end users with risk management tools in the futures and derivatives markets. They provide research and advice along with risk management control and expert market knowledge to a wide range of customers. Importantly, IBs meet customers, build relationships with family-owned farms and agricultural businesses in communities all across this country. FCMs have a vast network of IBs that serve this important client base. IBs must have a relationship with at least one FCM. The FCM handles trade execution, back office services for customers that the IBs bring to the FCM. The FCM also plays a pseudo SRO role in supervising and managing IB's compliance with regulation in the industry. IBs do not hold money or other customer assets in support of their customers' orders. Instead, they forward checks, bank transfers, and other forms of payment directly to the FCM. All the accounts introduced by the IB are carried on the books of the clearing firm on a fully disclosed basis. Also importantly, it should be noted that registration with the CFTC and the NFA membership is required for all IBs. Another important element of the end user community is education. In addition to offering customers a central point of access to futures exchanges and clearinghouses around the world and providing commodity futures market insights and strategies, FCMs also offer education about trading strategies, including courses about hedging with agricultural futures to customers and prospective customers. RJO, for example, provides commodity futures market insights and strategies that come from years of experience and exclusive on-the-ground market and cash market intelligence in both agricultural fundamentals and technical analysis. In addition, our risk experts work individually with customers to employ a proven process on behalf of clients. For example, we work with a client to understand their risk management objectives. Second, we perform a corporate-wide risk management assessment. And finally, we develop a customized risk management strategy suited to a client's specific operation and objectives. The FIA is also committed to providing and expanding access to education about futures and derivative markets to the general public, and particularly the agricultural community. First, the FIA has an independent affiliate called the Institute for Financial Markets. The IFM is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational foundation that seeks to increase public awareness and understanding of the importance of derivative markets and the financial services industry to the global economy. Equally important, the IFM seeks to improve the technical competence of those in the industry who deal with the public. So when I sum all this up, I'm looking here, there's really exciting opportunities on the horizon. Commodity markets are not going away, and they're only going to get bigger. So as related to futures, options, and centrally cleared derivative markets are playing and will continue to play a critical role in helping the global economy navigate the transition to a more sustainable economy. As energy companies continue to innovate and expand their biofuel production, financial risk management and hedging tools will only become more and more important, not just to farmers and ranchers producing the corn and soybeans and other products, but also to the energy companies that turn these crops into biofuels. These developments may lead to more participation in agricultural markets and may entice current FCMs to enter these markets or expand their existing commitments to the agricultural markets. In conclusion, FIA is committed to working with the agricultural end user community to improve access and expand educational resources to futures markets and risk management tools that can help them grow and compete in the 21st century. I'm sure I've created more questions than answers in my comments today. I'm happy to address Q&A at the appropriate time. And I want to thank the committee and the commission for allowing me to make these comments on behalf of the FIA. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Kurt, are you ready to begin your presentation?
I am. Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners, Swati. Thank you for the opportunity, members as well. Appreciate the opportunity to present here. I'm wearing several hats today. As a member of the AAC, I represent the Grain and Feed Association of Illinois, which is largely a collection of grain handling companies, grain warehouses, shippers, et cetera. I'm on the panel today representing the National Grain and Feed Association. Again, a similar member base to what the Grain and Feed Association of Illinois holds. And my occupation is with Advanced Trading Incorporated, and we are an introducing broker, which Jerry talked a bit about there in his presentation. And we share a lot of the same thoughts, the things Jerry went through and myself. And the numbers of FCMs have, of course, been declining. And Jerry noted that. And he further zoned in on the number of FCMs willing to take on client business. I would narrow that down even a little bit further from a practical perspective. Of the 47, I believe was his number, a fairly small fraction of those are willing to take on introducing broker business. Some of the others that will take on client business are designed around single entity, large volume trading companies, whereas an introducing broker like us represent a large number, not necessarily large volume per entity, but a large number of client entities. And so our business needs an FCM willing to provide the credit department in terms of looking at new account openings, et cetera, things along those lines, and that becomes a bit more onerous from the FCM perspective. And we realize that. We realize there's a cost of doing business, and it's not a woe is me complaint that that a large FCM won't necessarily take on our business, but it's a reality in the marketplace. And the point is, we have a relatively small number of FCMs that we can take our business to and find a good willing partner to operate in that environment. So it does become a concern. Within the IB world, we're what's known as an independent introducing broker, an IIB. The other introducing broker entity is a guaranteed introducing broker, a GIB. And I'm sure all of you are aware, a GIB is tied to a single FCM, has some capital guarantees, et cetera, compliance functions coming from that FCM. An independent introducing broker, IIB, like us, is not tied to a single FCM. We have our own capital requirements, our own compliance department. And point of that is a lot of our clients desire to have multiple FCM relationships through us as an IB. And that's always been the case, but it was accelerated 11 and 12 years ago with the failure of MF Global and PFG Best. That created a lot of need from our client base to say, hey, we can't be tied anymore to a single FCM. If there's a failure, we need a backup. And credit the CFTC. Some regulations have certainly tightened up, and we hope that there isn't another failure of those magnitudes. But those failures had a long tail, and the industry is still well aware, and internal risk management practices of our client base have led to that desire to have multiple relationships. So we have clients who desire, again, 2 or 3 FCM relationships with a relatively smaller pool of FCMs that we can do that with. So it's a concern as we look at things going forward. That there are some very good FCMs out there, and I don't mean to say that at all. Jerry's firm, is very focused on introducing broker type business, and full disclosure, we do have a relationship with RJ O'Brien as one of the FCMs that we do some business with. So there are good entities out there. It's just a shrinking number, and that's always a concern as we look at our business longer term. One of the things I wanted to note in response, or potentially in response to the shrinking number of FCMs, one could consider the direct clearing model, which caught a lot of attention a year ago with FTX proposing that on the financial side of the business, and the CME filing at that time to allow a direct clearing model, presumably in response to the FTX proposal, and we know that has not come to fruition. But from our client base, there's a lot of resistance to that model. The FCM provides a good spring in terms of capital risk, things like that, as opposed to directly clearing, particularly for the mid-size to smaller entity, producers, ranchers, smaller grain trading companies. The FCM world, again, provides a good spring in terms of risk management there. And the particular direct clearing model that FTX had proposed included, of course, the auto liquidation model as means of a margin risk management process. From a hedging perspective, that's very difficult to put in place. From a speculative standpoint, that certainly would have some merit. But from a hedging perspective, if one's hedges start to get auto liquidated because of an intraday margin issue, then one is out of position relative to the underlying cash grain position, which is not desirable at all. And to over margin an account to compensate for that has obviously a lot of capital cost, financing costs, et cetera. So we're strong advocates for the FCM model as opposed to a direct clearing model in that regard. So maybe the final comment I would make, understand that this is all economics for the most part, as opposed to a regulatory type issue. We do regularly get approached by different entities to potentially form a new FCM, a client-focused, a smaller entity-focused type FCM. And if the economics justified that, we would certainly go in that direction. It would really change the capital model for us. It would likely mean a little less efficiency for the farmer, rancher, mid-sized to smaller grain trading company, et cetera. But we would get there if the economics justified that. So that's maybe a note of positivity to end it. Today, the FCM world is still certainly serving our needs. It's just a concern going forward that those entities continue to get smaller and smaller and the competitiveness ends up declining. So thank you. I too will be glad to take questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Kurt. Lane, are you ready to begin your presentation?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, fellow commissioners, and this committee for the opportunity to provide a few brief comments. My name is Lane Carlson, and I am representing the Minneapolis Grain Exchange. Our primary ag contract is hard red spring wheat futures and options. Access to a contract market to hedge all forms of farm and ranch production is essential. It should also be fundamental. As a contract market, MGX needs customers trading our futures and options products. We want to fulfill our mission to provide a service and allow for price discovery and risk mitigation. MGX has heard the frustrations in the rural community about the consolidation going on in the FCM and IB communities, which reduces market access alternatives. FCMs do not have to be a clearing member at MGX to have access to our markets. Being a clearing member means connectivity to our clearinghouse and all the obligations and responsibilities that go along with it. There are a number of FCMs and IBs accommodating farm producers, merchandisers, and end users currently trading at the MGX wheat futures market that have an account relationship with a clearing member. MGX rules and financial requirements for active FCMs on our market are not any more burdensome than what all FCMs need to comply with now under CFTC and industry financial and reporting requirements. MGX does not want to create unnecessary access barriers to FCMs or market participants. The decline in the number of FCMs over the last decade has been very unfortunate, in part due to Dodd-Frank. However, from the MGX perspective, we promote market access and support competition and ease of entry for FCMs and their customers. Having multiple FCMs to choose from that are close to a customer's home base may be ideal for farmers and customers, but that is not currently the case. However, from what MGX has observed, there are FCMs well qualified to represent a farmer's interest, regardless of location. Also, it's important to recognize that there are many elements contributing to access to markets, from the CTAs, the IBs, brokers, and FCMs. The network as a whole appears to be working, but we shouldn't be taking it for granted. There are areas where access points are less than ideal, and the various commodity interests, as well as the regulatory world, should look for ways to improve market access. In short, MGX supports equal and fair access for all who need and want to be able to hedge and trade. Again, I thank everyone for their time and for this opportunity. I can answer questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, Kurt, and Lane for your informative presentations and remarks. We will now open the floor to questions and comments from the members of the committee regarding the presentation. For members in virtual attendance, as a reminder, please use your raise hand feature to ask a question or use the chat. Do we have any questions or comments from members participating by phone? Okay. Thank you to the committee members for those questions and comments. Do we have any questions or comments from any of the commissioners, or any comments from panelists in here in the room? Mr. Salmon.
Thank you. So Derek Salmon from CME Group. I want to start by thanking Jerry and Kurt for their comments on representing the needs and the interest of the end user community. Small farmers and ranchers form the core backbone of our global commodities franchise. Without that open interest that they bring, they are the ones with the original risk literally in the ground. They come every day to our markets and need to be able to access these markets. So we're in full support of what we heard from Lane as well in terms of creating fair and equitable access to all of these critical derivatives markets that serve not just domestic purposes, but set the prices for grains and oilseeds and other products globally. We've spent a lot of time talking about the access portion of this. There's a piece in front of that, which I know a lot of us are equally concerned about, and that's education. And that's getting down to the grassroots levels in the ways that we can all serve our global and our rural communities with the access to educational resources, understanding the power of derivatives markets to help them manage the very risks, Commissioner Mersinger, that you were talking about, your dad refers to. That's really buffeting small farmers and ranchers globally. As an exchange, we rely heavily and fully on our FCM community and IBs and all of the CTAs of this world to create access to those communities of folks. That said, we're constantly looking for ways that we can extend access and understanding, knowledge, and access to our market. So we spent a lot of time at grassroots levels. I actually mentioned some of this at my House Ag Committee testimony in March about the ways in which we support state fairs, 4-H clubs with scholarships. We'll be down at the Illinois State Fair later this summer to participate in the auction of the championship animals. We provide scholarships and educational resources for on-the-ground groups to understand in trading communities, and games that we set up to get people to understand what these products are, what these tools are, why they matter. We've got a really strong relationship with the National Association of Farm Broadcasters. That's important to get our message out there as to what risk management is and why it matters to everyone on the ground. So we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we all have an opportunity and responsibility to make sure that we're extending educational resources and that we are extending access in line with why does that access matter. So we're in full support of that. We have many ways in which we're supporting the growth of the educational efforts at grassroots levels, and certainly are keenly want to be part of the solution for extending access to all of those participants that have this risk. We need to be equally focused on that part of the spectrum of our community, as well as the global participation from buy-side hedge funds, asset managers, banks, and everybody else that's in our markets as well. Without small farmers and ranchers with the original risk in the ground, our markets are missing a key component of the ecosystem. So full support of what Jerry and Kurt talked about and the comments made by Lane as well.
Buddy.
Thank you. Just a comment. I agree with everything that was said. I appreciate this topic being put in front of the group. The American Cotton Shippers Association, we represent the big ABCD agribusinesses all the way down to the country cotton gin that buys fiber from farmers and sells it to a local mill. And we see a varying utility and access to FCM services that's critically important to all market participants. You see a very different model from a large self-clearing commercial to that mid-sized commercial that might not have the capital to perform those services internally and may be the only market point access to a local producer, as far as deliverable supply or access to move a commodity and make that liquid and create cash flow in a timely fashion would dictate who your counterparty is. And then down to the retail producer or end user on a small scale, which Swati and I discussed by email. So I would just flag that different thresholds of participants have different access, and it's critically important across that profile. We see our farmers rely on merchandisers to perform these risk management services on their behalf more. We think the hedging is done on the farm less now than it was decades ago, and we see that trend continuing based on education and some of the reasons that have been discussed. So I just think it's important to think about this through the lens of geography and who your market participants are and where they may be in this scale profile that was also illuminated as being very important. So thank you for putting this topic on the table.
All right. Do we have any questions or comments from any of the commissioners? Oh, sorry. Mr. Gallagher.
Ed Gallagher with the National Milk Producers Federation. Also, I work for Dairy Farmers of America, the largest milk business in the United States. And for the dairy producers, there's, because of a great combination of programs from USDA through the Dairy Margin Coverage Program and through their crop insurance programs that are available for milk, there is easy access and lots of coverage for smaller dairy farmers. For the larger dairies, which, so the 20% of the farms that produce 80% of the milk and That 80% is more milk than is produced in most countries around the world. They have fairly decent access to introducing brokers, but it's a shrinking pool. We run an aggregation program for our farmer owners, so we do risk management for them through forward contracts, and so we're aggregating all kinds of sizes of dairies to bring to the markets. And what we've seen is, as this consolidation has occurred, there are fewer entities, fewer FCMs that are interested in handling our business. We're the largest dairy business in the United States, the fourth largest in the world. And so, there is a growing concern about how these businesses consolidate, and as they get larger, their view on working in the agricultural commodity space. So I appreciate this topic, and I appreciate everybody's comments on this, and I would agree with everyone. And Derek, you did hit it right on the head with education. What we see as the biggest challenge across our farmer owners is consistency of use of the products. And so that's an educational challenge that we are involved in every single day, working with our farmer owners to help them understand the importance to their families' financial well-being to be consistently using risk management products. Thank you.
Patrick, I see you have your hand raised virtually. Do you want to comment?
Sure. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you well.
Great. Thank you. Patrick Coyle, here representing the National Grain and Feed. Appreciate you hosting this meeting. I apologize for not being able to attend in person today. I also wanted to, agree with a lot of the comments that have been made already. From the NGFA's perspective, it's a topic that's been brought up on some of our committees. That it hasn't reached critical levels. There's enough access, but certainly the trend of FCMs and the number of FCMs that are available has been getting noticed. And the concern is that if that trend were to continue, would we reach levels or a point would be a bit more critical in terms of access for enough participants that most virtually all of our participants do participate in hedging their risks, and so access to FCMs and markets is certainly very important.
Great, thank you. Now, probably any other comments before I turn it over to the commissioners? Mr. McHarg.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Mark McHarg from American Farm Bureau. I'm a fourth-generation farmer there in Nebraska, corn, soybeans, hogs, popcorn. And it seems like in the discussions that I have, both in Nebraska level and at the American Farm Bureau level that represents all ag producers across the country, regardless of the commodity, it does seem to focus around, and we have the Farm Bill, we have all of our crop insurance products, and it's really merging those types of products together with some sort of hedging options to get full coverage. And I think absolutely the education part of that seems difficult as there's moving targets and how to kind of offset that risk with a number of different products, I think is important. So educating through that. Another trend that I've seen in the market is, as an individual person, it seems like we in agriculture are partnering up more often with other producers, or whether it be a co-op, whether it be another group, to actually help with the marketing side of the equation. It just seems like as our operations get larger, for us to be experts in everything is becoming more difficult. And so engaging partners that help us actually place those trades and do those trades, I think is a growing trend. I know it's been mentioned that, it's so important off of the farm, or that agriculture, as farmers and ranchers, we do for the protection. And it's really figuring out, it seems like more often, who do we partner up with to help us with protecting our crops that are actually in the ground and livestock.
All right, thank you. Commissioners.
Thank you. That was just excellent presentations, and I'm glad to be talking about this. Maybe this question is for Jerry. On the trend of the declining FCMs, is there anything you see that will stop that trend or reverse that trend, or instead are you seeing that trend is likely to continue?
Thank you, Commissioner. I think the trend is stable right now. I don't see market participants exiting the FCM space, but as I alluded to in my comments, the barrier to entry is very high. We talk about technology a lot, but the cost of compliance is very high as well. Since the great financial crisis, there's been a series of improvements, I would say, in the safety of customer assets, but there are also costs associated with those improvements. So to start an FCM from scratch is, with any scale, that really is going to mitigate some of the concerns we have here, is not likely. What's more likely is an existing FCM, kind of embracing agriculture as well. But we are America. We are America. It's a competitive environment. What we have is very competitive marketplace. You got an agri-concerned CFO. Does everybody have this echo that I have?
We hear you, Jerry, loud and clear, no echo.
Okay, great. Maybe everyone can mute so the echo disappears, but it's a highly competitive market. So commission rates gets driven down to a level that return on capital becomes unattractive for certain FCMs. And that's just part of our country and capitalism. And so, with modest returns on capital, it's also not enticing for a current FCM to move into the space. So I think we have, there's plenty of access for farmers and ranchers that we have today. I think if we have more FCMs exit the space, it could be a problem, but I think it's steady at this point, Commissioner. I don't see it declining, but I also don't see a rush of new FCMs coming into the space either.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
So Jerry, I'm just going to follow up because, my question is similar to Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero's in some respects, but Kurt, you mentioned the economics. I get that. And then Jerry, at the beginning of your statement, which you just reiterated, we don't see necessarily a continued decline in the number of FCMs. It's stable. I sort of pointed this out in my opening statement, and knowing those figures you cited where we were 120 some odd registered FCMs 2 decades ago, and now we're in the 50s or so. What I didn't realize was that second layer number you said, the 47, in terms of those willing to take on client money, and then Kurt, your point about those willing to take on IBs. So Kurt, I do want to ask you this, and this sort of dovetails with what Jerry just said. Something that I recall from a decade ago hearing, and then even essentially only until a few years ago, if not last year, the interest rate environment that has a huge impact on, the FCM economic model and whether or not it's viable. And you would need massive scale to retain that business in a low interest rate environment. And we've certainly been in a low interest rate environment for well over a decade, again, up until about a year or so ago. And I'm not suggesting, or now at least concluding, that we're going to see a bump necessarily of FCMs, but Kurt, you did mention you do sometimes have conversations about starting an entity. Have the economics changed at all such that you think the conversation shifts? Or is it still, there's too many dynamics, whether, Jerry pointed out a lot of, costs have gone up, whether it's on the technology side. Obviously, the economies of scale of starting a business in a competitive environment are hugely significant. Commissioner Pham mentioned capital requirements and some of the shifting methodologies of how we calculate capital, and then just the regulatory requirements that we've seen come up since 2008. What's the dynamic now, and has it changed that you would even think twice about it or think differently than you did a year or two ago?
Thank you. Great question in those regards. And the interest rate return to an FCM is certainly historically been a key part of the business model there. If there's an upside to the low interest rate environment that we came through, I think some of the surviving, the long-term FCMs were able in that environment to look at some other profit margin type opportunities, find some ways to get lean on some factors, to take a little margin in other places. And now that the interest rates have crept back up, it's made them more efficient and stronger in that sense. They had to change, had to adjust with the times, or had to exit the business, which a lot of them did. But the surviving ones, and survive is a strong word, but the surviving ones, again, had done enough things to make some changes that now I think their balance sheets and their operating margins are much better than what they had been 5, 6, 7 years ago. So that's a positive from that regard. To get to your core question, I don't know that it necessarily shifts us towards looking that direction. We'd still, all things equal, rather have our model be that we aren't the capital intensive market participant, that still falls to the FCMs. And so the optimistic side is if those existing FCMs willing to take on client and IB business are now in a stronger position and desire to remain in the business, we'd still like to go that direction. The flip side to having higher interest rates making an FCM more operable is that our capital costs, if we were to go down that road, have also gone up. And that's not necessarily a one-for-one perspective, but the access and cost of capital would certainly be a lot more than it would have been 3 and 4 years ago. So I wouldn't say we're moving in that direction anymore because of the interest rate environment, but that is certainly a key to FCM profitability.
Thanks, Kurt. So the second question, I think, is about the education. Derek, you mentioned this, and the role CME plays, obviously critical and appreciated, I think, from an industry standpoint. But I do think, having heard Jerry speak, and then Kurt, and then even Derek and some of the comments, I think it's important that we pinpoint where the education needs to occur, right? Because I think it's easy to think about, the Farm Bill was mentioned, right? You have commodity programs, you have crop insurance, and a number of other tools that are available to producers. How do we maintain the CFTC and futures market as one of those tools in the toolbox? And we can certainly educate the producers and make them comfortable to the extent they can be comfortable with the idea of participating in futures markets and the risks associated with that, but still the risk management opportunities. But I do think that, and this is an area where I think the CFTC can be helpful, is what role do we have to play, or what education needs to happen at the IB level and at the FCM level, particularly for those FCMs and IBs that don't provide those services to the ag constituency, right? I think there are decent efforts. We can always get better and rely on the exchanges and the infrastructure to educate the end client. But how do we get the infrastructure, the intermediaries? And I love this idea of getting IBs more hooked into FCMs, but how do we create, not necessarily, I want to use this word carefully, incentives for them to even think about this business and to participate in this business and hook into FCMs such that they can provide more access to growers? Because to Jerry's point, Kurt, to yours as well, this 50s number is probably not going to change. It might fluctuate over the course of the years, but it's going to ebb and flow at best. We're not going to see, probably a halving like we have in the past few decades. But I think I'm a little bit encouraged by this conversation because I didn't necessarily dig a few layers deep into the role IBs play, whether guaranteed or independent, and then what we can do collectively to educate the IB community to provide those services to the producer community. So if there are any thoughts, would certainly welcome them. But I do think this is an area that we can certainly play through our education arm and just, quite frankly, speeches and discussions that the commission has and meetings that we have with that community, so that hopefully there continues to be, at a minimum, stable access, but if not, increasing and growing access for producers.
Jerry, go ahead.
Thank you.
Is your hand raised?
Are you guys good for me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great, thanks. Great comments by everybody. As far as education goes, one point that should be made, Chair, is that there's an entity called Futures Fundamentals. It's a collective industry-wide effort to develop and promote free education, and it's supported by the CME Group, ICE, the National Futures Association, and FIA. So we have a nice platform that we could promote collectively as an industry into the Introducing Broker Network. Now, one thing that should be noted, as far as introducing brokers go, the number of introducing brokers have declined significantly as well over the last 15 years. But I think the IBs that are left today and that service the agri communities are top-notch folks. I mean, really know their business, and they cover a wide geographical part of our country. Particularly someone like Kirk's company, very, very well thought of. They educate their customers. They're top-notch, and there's many of them like that. So I agree with you. Education is a key point. We do have a platform, an industry-wide collective platform. We'd love for the CFTC to hook into it with us and help us move it out into the community to improve education. Now, I wanted to also say one other thing about interest income and the impact FCMs. It has improved the financial profile of FCMs, but we live in a way different world than the last time there was interest income in this space, which was well over 10 years ago. And that is, the customers are well more versed in putting their money to work. So maybe 10, 15 years ago, FCMs had a bit of a nest egg from interest income. It's not quite the same anymore. Everyone wants to buy a T-bill. Everyone wants interest credit to their accounts. So it may not be the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that so many people think about it. And I think my FCM executives in the space would probably echo the same comments related to the interest income. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jerry.
I have just a quick question, and this is just kind of related to the educational piece, but I think it's also kind of an access point as well. And I'm not sure who wants to answer this, but has there been any partnerships with maybe community banks or that level of interaction? I just know from my own experience, that's where a lot of small farmers and ranchers really go for their financial education. They trust their community banker. It might be their neighbor. It might be a fellow farmer. And I've always wondered, especially, given some of the risk that comes with these operating loans, has there been any attempts to get to the farmers and ranchers at that level at the community bank and help them understand the hedging opportunity here and how they can help mitigate some of the risk that comes with farming in general?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and it follows up well with the previous question as well, education related. So directly, Commissioner Messenger, we do some meetings on a regular basis with community banks or crop insurance type companies, entities like that, who are interested in just having an outside speaker come to speak with their producers about education, about hedging, about market fundamentals, things like that. And we're very willing to do that kind of thing and encourage our sales staff to get involved in that type of thing. A couple other comments I was going to tag on related to education. I'll commend the commission for the meeting you had a couple of years ago in conjunction with Kansas State University. That was really well attended, spoken highly of. It's something I hope that we can resume. I think at the December meeting of this council, there was some discussion of resuming that program. And that to us is a great way to start the education kind of from your level down, even if it wasn't so much direct market participants in that, although I know there were plenty of them, plenty of end users and trading companies, et cetera, but also representatives who do business with those entities, and including the producer level. So that was a strong educational opportunity. The National Grain and Feed and the State Grain and Feed Associations do a good job as well of having presenters from the futures industry in front of their membership bases. The NGFA's Country Elevator Council often has a company like ours or a company like Mr. Wheeler's, speaking in front of them about the various futures education models, futures tools, things like that are available. So we're very much in favor, very much support the educational opportunities that you're speaking about. So thank you.
Mr. Sammons.
Yeah, maybe just jumping on a couple points, and Jerry beat me to it talking about futures fundamentals. This is a coalition that was brought together not just by one part of this ecosystem, but it's CIA or CME, FIA, NFA, IFM, and then our charitable arm CME Foundation. This was explicitly put together to be able to understand the needs and the gaps in understanding for derivatives markets overall. To be clear, this is not just ags focused. This is all derivatives markets. So this is a broad-based educational, but it's a platform within which we've got lots and lots of component pieces to understand exactly how markets work, how to use them. It's literally the fundamentals of derivatives markets. That's really important. I think that when we think about education, there's two parts of it. There's the content and the distribution. Each of us has maybe a slightly different role to play. On the exchange side, we don't directly touch end users. We work through a wholesale distribution network, whether it's our FCM community, our IBs. We have a global sales team that's arrayed by client segment. We have a global of our global sales team that is specifically and only tasked with working with our distribution partners, our clearing firms, bank and non-bank FCMs, our IBs. In fact, we're going to have two of our ag leads out at Jerry's IB conference a little bit later this summer, specifically talking about ags. So there are ways that between content and distribution, those things have to come together. Some of us are more on the content side, but we need distribution and access. And some folks, are looking for the content because they have distribution and access. So, each of us needs to find who can broker what portions of those, where the gaps are, and we can all participate in that. So from our perspective, we think that that is a gap and a role we have to play. We're serving that. Would love to hear the Commission's thoughts about where between content and distribution you can help extend the influence, access, and raise the level of importance of these conversations.
Great, thank you. Jerry, probably a closing comment to keep on schedule.
Well, I don't have any prepared closing comments. I think this has been a wonderful dialogue amongst the industry participants. And, when we have these moments where we come together and speak, in the fashion we have today, it all feels good. We have to follow up on it, though. A lot of times you lose momentum after a meeting like this. And I'd encourage the commission, the staff to try to set the leadership for us on this education matter and bring us all together to help the community. And if we really want to get deep into the mid-level and smaller size farmers and ranchers, it's through the introducing broker network. They're the best suited to serve the community and the farmers out in the country. They're out there, they live in the communities, they service these folks. And to Commissioner's points, they work with the community banks. And I think it's an excellent point that we could extend the arm of education to the community banks. They could probably lean on it. Many community banks already lean on the risk management systems of the FCMs. We allow them complete access to their customers' trading styles and the pro formas of risk they have in the marketplace. But let's try to keep the momentum that we're building here. And I applaud the chair and the commission for bringing this meeting together. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for the robust discussion and excellent questions. And with that, we'll turn to our second presentation of the day. Susan Olson with Action Intel. Susan, please take it away.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. And I wanted to say thank you to Chairman Benham, to Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero, Commissioner Mersinger, Commissioner Pham, Scott, and Swati, and Wes, and the rest of the committee for the opportunity to engage today. As you all talked about in actual depth in your comments this morning, I'm going to talk about the recent disruptions to the lower Mississippi River as it relates to grain flows and markets. And I'm going to do that through the lens of data to try to bring some tangible perspective to the recent events that have happened. But I also want to do this in an effort to kind of open eyes and minds to generally what's possible, through data in future endeavors. So So yeah, just a quick introduction to myself. I'm an engineer by trade. I got my PhD in aerospace and mechanical engineering at Notre Dame. I did work in research using a lot of sensing and data with NASA and the Office of Naval Research, and then moved to the commercial sector working with Honeywell on the Joint Strike Fighter. So I spent the bulk of my career, though, as I moved more back in the research field with sensors, doing work with a company called Genscape for about 13 years, which was developing new transparency for markets using market intelligence and measured data to help people understand fundamentally what's happening. So I built a business from the ground up in agriculture and biofuels at Genscape. So I did a lot of work sensing things like ethanol storage, soybean processing, and transportation in the grain markets. I spent a little time after that as a chief operating officer of a data science company where I ran a data science team doing a lot of work with machine learning and analytics. And so that's kind of true to the thread of my career. And then recently was the chief operating officer of Demeter Logistics, where we introduced a digital trading platform for cash grain markets. And I started my own company with my colleague and co-founder, Brittany Botts, in March, getting back to more pure market intelligence with Action Intel. So that's a little bit about me, just to give my background so you understand like who's talking today to you about markets. So next slide, please. So I think, in some of the past committee meetings, you have talked and heard from people about, the disruptions that have happened to the grain markets, specifically over the last decade. Some of the ones that come to mind are the Great Flood of 2019, Hurricane Ida's landfall in 2021, and the extreme low water conditions, I think, that are all too familiar from the last quarters of 2022. So today's presentation really highlights the impact of those disruptive events, but doing it from a perspective of logistics and how those logistics impact markets. And so I'll be talking about the grain tows journey down to New Orleans on the Mississippi River. So I want to just give some context because there is such a wide and broad and wonderful array of people here from different markets and perspectives. And I want to talk about the importance of Mississippi River barge freight and how it's impacting, not just specifically that leg of the market, but how it affects cash markets, how it affects futures markets. Barge freight is a core part of the discovery of what's called the stiff NOLA basis, and that's the most liquid cash forward grain market in the US. The freight delivery cost to its destination, which is almost always New Orleans, is a dominant part of the equation for the delivery value equivalent calculation for a futures position. And so that's what's presented here in this slide. So you see, the costs of those are heavily dependent on barge freight. And as such, barge freight impacts the convergence of futures contracts. And so today I want to talk about how using data can help recognize both logistics snarls, but also recoveries that impact barge freight and thus the markets that are attached to it. So I'll be talking about everybody I'm sure has been to Vicksburg, Mississippi, right? So I'll be talking a lot today about Vicksburg, Mississippi. It does have a fantastic port area and also is a home, I think, to launch point for a lot of these river cruises that happen up and down the Mississippi River. So it's a very important point in transit for Mississippi River traffic. So Vicksburg is situated, kind of between where major tows of grain are built to be transited down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and New Orleans itself. So I've kind of chosen this as a waypoint to talk about these metrics. Mainline towboats push grain barges down the lower Mississippi River to New Orleans. And about half of the US exports, and a lot of times more, in grains and oilseeds go out of New Orleans. And 90%, and sometimes more, of the grain that's fed to these export facilities comes from barge. So river, again, as you pointed out in your comments, is a critical artery, to delivery of grain to export, and the overall economics of grain from United States grain. So these tows are built, meaning that barges are attached to the tow in either usually St. Louis or Cairo areas. So above St. Louis, there are locks and dams on the Mississippi River and its tributaries. On the Ohio River, there are also locks and dams. Once you get south of St. Louis, there aren't locks and dams. So you can transit much larger tows of barges. And so that's why they're built there. So they're built, and then by the time they pass through Vicksburg, they're usually mostly composed. There is some grain that is produced south of there, but largely that's a point where they're mostly composed. And then as these towboats, once they've delivered their grain, are going back up with empty barges and backhauling carries of other commodities, that's another waypoint to look at how that's happened. So just kind of wanted to give a geographical picture of what we're talking about today. So we're using a lot of data sources today to derive these metrics. And so the data sources come from, AIS data, which is the transponder systems that are actually on the towboats, not the barges themselves, but the tows. USDA data. So there's a lot of wonderful data produced by the USDA, including regular reporting of barge freight and barge unloads. Also geospatial data. So a lot of this, to bring context to data, you have to understand where things are actually happening on the river. So things like satellite imagery, other geospatial data, looking at the river level itself, which has a massive impact on the ability to transit the river. There's also an interesting data source I wanted to point out that's produced by the American Commercial Barge Line Association called ACBL Currents, which is a pretty robust log of events of things that have happened along the river that have caused transit delays and those sorts of things. So it's kind of an effort that company makes to provide some transparency into those things. There's the raw data, and then there's meaningful data. And so to get there, one of the steps that you have to do is to prepare the data. So there's a lot of extensive cleaning and filtering, a lot of quality assurance that needs to happen to make sure that when you have analytics processes that are running things through these systems, that they make sense from the endpoint perspective. Doing things like, what is a mainline towboat? So a mainline towboat has to have a certain amount of horsepower, right, to push the grain barges down the Mississippi River, which is different than the Kirby towboats that push tank barges up and down the river. So you have to be able to figure those things out. And then just daily, weekly aggregation, doing benchmarking so that you understand not just what something's absolute level is, but how is that different from what is normal, right? Or what's over a 10-year average. I will say that even with QA, data is never perfect. And like us all, it gets better with age. So I just wanted to mention that there are things, as time progresses, more things you can incorporate to make signals better. I wanted to, talk about specifically, that's the data cleaning process. There's some metrics that I'm going to focus on today that I want to just introduce you all to. So these, I think, will be somewhat new. I don't think that these are things that are normally commercially present in markets today. It's something that we're working on to try to bring some additional transparency into markets. But a couple of those things is what direction is the tow going and what is the turn time? So for instance, if a tow is going through Vicksburg southbound to New Orleans, it's going to turn around and come back up the river. And so how long does it take for that tow to take its southbound journey and to come back? Accumulating those metrics over time. The other thing is the tow count. So just simply looking at, if you pick a geographical region like Vicksburg, how many tows are going upstream and downstream through Vicksburg? So as a total and both as an upstream and downstream count. And you can look at those things over different periods. You can look at it over a day or a week. And then seasonal averages, which I talked about. Some of the other data you'll see is river gauge data. That's at Vicksburg. Spot barge freight. So this is the barge freight market. The CBOT soybean futures get the data from bar chart, and export inspection volumes from the USDA. So on this coming slide, you're going to see a story of what this data shows, from 2015 to the first quarter of 2023. So every time I look at this chart, I see something new, but let me walk you through it to talk about what you're seeing here. So these are line tow transit features, these mainline tows, the ones that are candidates to push large tows of grain down the Mississippi River. Those transit features, the river stage, and the freight. And so the top line, the blue line that you're seeing, is the tow count, and that includes both upstream and downstream tows. And the next one is the southern turn time. So when a mainline towboat goes through Vicksburg, how long does it take to turn around and come back? Then you have the river stage, which is, basically the purple line that you see there is the seasonal average. of the river stage, and then the green line is the instantaneous river stage. So when you see that in excess or a deficit, you can clearly see periods where that changes from what is considered like a normal river level for the season. And then finally, barge freight. And so that's down on the bottom graph. And so what you see in the kind of the teal blue line is a 10-year average. I will say for those of you that, I know that have a lot of subject matter expertise in markets, that in 2014, there were some shifting changes in the amounts and types of towboats and that were available. But I looked at the different averages and it really doesn't matter. So there's not a whole lot of difference in the 10-year average and that particular average. So the orange line is the instantaneous barge freight. And so where you start to see aberrations from the 10-year average, you can really see where markets are impacted from a freight perspective. So to kind of draw attention to some and not all of the events that have disrupted the Mississippi River over this time period, you see kind of the A, B, C, D marked lines there. And so the first line was, there was a period of high water that was much more short-lived than 2019 and 2018, but you can see an elevation in the water level, you see elevation in turn time, you see reduction in the number of tows that are transiting through a place like Vicksburg, and you see elevated barge freight. You see in 2019, the beginning of the Great Flood, which was a long period of high water levels that occurred. You can see, impacts of barge freight in certain parts of 2019. You can also see, the turn times and being somewhat seasonal, but also being an elevated impact. In 2021, in August of 21, we had the impact of, unfortunately, Hurricane Ida, which came through and was pretty much a direct hit on New Orleans. And elevated barge freight from that period, also elevated turn times and tow count. And then we had extremely low water levels in the latter part of 2022. And there were a variety of impacts there from a logistical standpoint, from both the tow count reductions, the turn time elevation, and also a prolonged period of increased levels of barge freight. During that period, one of the things that I wanted to show, we're going to deep dive into Hurricane Ida and then deep dive into the drought in some coming slides to get into this data into more detail and kind of the direct relationship to the markets. But I do want to point out that, in addition to turn time and tow count, another thing that strongly impacts barge freight is how many barges you can put on a tow if that's restricted. And as the discussion about the Missouri River earlier, how much grain can you actually put into a barge? And so when you have restrictions of those things, those also compound the availability of freight, which in the supply demand fundamentals then pulls the barge freight higher. So in the periods like the extremely low water of 2022, you had reductions in tow size from something like 40 to 25 to 35, and then draft was reduced, to 9'6" or 9 foot or even 8'6" from, I think, what's normally around 12 feet of draft for that particular part of the river. So, Swati, if you don't mind to go to the next. So kind of starting with Hurricane Ida, just a refresher on kind of the impact of that hurricane, but that was in August of 2021. The NOLA area of the river was closed for a few days, really due to things like down power lines in the river. It was just not safe. And I think the resources of the government and the communities did a fantastic job of clearing the way to get that open. There was export facility damage directly. You see this picture of the Cargill facility, that's their export facility. And there were several others. And they also had extensive power outages. And in some cases, the power outages were more extensive than what were reported during Hurricane Katrina. So these impacted the ability to be able to export grains. So back to the data. You see that kind of the stick with the circle on it, that's when the Hurricane Ida made landfall, and there was a port closure for several days after that. The yellow line that you're seeing in the graph is this average tow time and looking at the last 7 days. The white line there is the 95% level where tow times almost always fall below that. So you see that there's almost 3.5 weeks there after Hurricane Ida where the tow turn time between Vicksburg and coming back in south was elevated above a 95% level. In the data world, that's, not absolute surety, but certainly saying that something different is happening than normal with a pretty high confidence level. Then you also have in the blue line there, that's the number of tows that was going through Vicksburg. So you see, and that's the southern portion of towboats. So you see that that was also restricted during that period of time. So about 3.5 weeks it took the market to, or took the logistics really to recover from that event. Then kind of moving to the next slide, I wanted to overlay what the spot barge freight looked like through this period. And I've left on this graph that elevated turn time so you can kind of see what was happening logistically and then what was happening to freight markets during that time. I will say that, just based on, and many of you are probably familiar with these markets, but that barge freight is typically bought in advance many times. So there's not a lot of barge freight that's bought spot. However, the spot market does impact the CIF-NOLA basis, and it does impact markets in that way. So what I wanted to point out from the white line here, which is showing the spot barge freight, this is the amount of barge freight that's above the seasonal. So barge freight does change seasonally because of the harvest, but this is showing what's above seasonal. So you can see here that during the period of elevated barge freight corresponded to the period where you saw these elevated turn times. So the recovery, you can see are happening in a very similar time frame. And the next slide, this is showing the future spread between this is from November 2021 to January 2022. So you see you see that alongside the barge freight, you see the inverse that is happening, and when the hurricane hits, you see that the spreads, go closer together, and that you see that the barge freight is increasing. There was a period of time there, typically you would see things go from an inverse to carry market, and that carry market didn't emerge until, after the hurricane disruptions had relieved. So I just kind of wanted to show what the data shows from a perspective of how markets were changing during that period. Okay, so just moving, quickly into the second event that I wanted to talk about today, which is the 2022 drought. So again, just an overview to kind of highlight some of these things. And obviously, I couldn't talk about everything. I know that there are things that are going on right now that are impacting markets as well. But the idea here was to kind of show some of the recent things that have happened in the context of data. But this was had a big impact on grain markets. And there were record low river levels in cities like Cairo, Illinois, Memphis, and Greenville, which are very important waypoints on the artery of the lower Mississippi River. You had salt water that was backflowing into the Mississippi River, and there had to be a sill that was built to try to prevent that from happening. I was mentioning earlier that something that affects the barge freight is the tow size. So the tow is typically 30 to 40 barges. That was reduced for 25 barges from all the way from the middle of September to December, which is a very critical part of harvest, for the United States for oilseeds and grains. And then the draft was reduced in the middle of October, both north and southbound. And that was about a 24 to 30% reduction in tonnage per barge versus normal conditions. So you have a lot of logistical issues, as Commissioner pointed out earlier, with those things when they happen. You also have occurrences of dead freight. So you get charged for barge freight for a minimum amount. If you don't load that minimum amount, you still get charged for that freight. So that was a cost impact that was incurred by shippers. So there are kind of two categories of disruptions for low water. The first, and I'm talking about drought as it relates to low water. And obviously, there are things that impacts drought from both a growth and harvest perspective from production. But this is talking more about the low water. So there are navigation and bottleneck issues. So just towboats trying to navigate down a reduced river channel, and then the population of different towboats going upstream and downstream. Then you also have barge fleet access issues, which is something that was highlighted from the conversation and comments made at the opening comments. That you have these channels where barges get loaded that get narrow because of the reduction in the river size. So it's hard to get to them or get them out of the channel. So you have to do kind of extreme things, or you have to wait, right, to get those barges out. So this was a pretty long event horizon. So I've just kind of focused this graph in on that event horizon. So starting from the point when the tow size and draft reduction started till when they ended. And so you see the two lines here that were shown during the Hurricane Ida chart, but the yellow line is the average tow turn time, and the blue line, which I want to point more of your attention to, is the mainline tow count. So you see that there are a lot of like really large swings in that mainline tow count. So you see a big one that's happening there in the beginning of the beginning of October. Then another big one happens where you get down to almost no tows going through that period for a period of time, and then a big recovery swing after that. During that recovery swing, it also corresponded to a period where you saw elevated average turn times for those towboats. So again, overlaying the barge freight, you can see, I mean, those numbers on the right-hand side of the graph are very large numbers. So for increases in barge freight, it's something that is quite unusual to see that level of increase in spot freight. So you can see that as these recovery waves are happening in the downstream flow of towboats, so they're starting to, recover and transit starting to begin. You can see what happens to barge freight, as it starts to relieve from some of those ultra highs that were happening between September and, the end of October. I do want to point out, however, that there's a very long tail to that barge freight increase. And you can see, that carried over through the end of 2022. So, $10 freight increase above a seasonal average is substantive. And also, I think, in talking about forward markets for barge freight, you're not just talking now about the spot barge freight, but you're talking about things that could impact, forward markets of procuring barge freight. This is the futures curve, the spreads. Again, I know I'll work backwards from this one. I know that the most notable thing on this chart seems to be the large change at the end where the futures, basically where that month closed and rolled over to the next month. But that is effectively something that can be affected by a lot of different things, and that is into delivery of the period. So part of the thing to show about this chart is that there are other things that affect those spreads, obviously, other than just barge freight in and of itself. But you do see in the future spreads from November to January, in that period of time, especially when you first started to see impact on the freight, that you did see an impact that was also happening on those spreads, in the end of September. Just a quick comment here. There's a lot of lines on this chart, but I want to point your attention to the dashed white line, which is the 5-year average for Mississippi River export inspections. So this is grains that are going out of, NOLA for export, and then mostly NOLA for export. And then you also have the 10-year average is the dashed green line. The gray line is the end of 2022. And I don't think it surprises anyone to see that 9, 10, 11, 12, you see, reductions in the amount of exports that are going out of New Orleans. I think the other thing I wanted to draw your attention to, though, is that, the season proceeds, into 2023, but you see that those numbers on the gray line are not a whole lot different than the average. You do see some elevation there that is occurring. So that does continue, into those trends through 2023. So you kind of have to look forward as well as just looking in the months that are happening at the end. So, I presented a lot of material and data today. I really, again, appreciate and am grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion, and certainly as appropriate from the committee and the commission, I would very much love to engage in any comments or questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Susan. So I'd like to ask if there are any questions of the committee members. We have about 5 minutes remaining. I think we have a hard stop at 10:45, but certainly we want to entertain any questions from you all and then to the commissioners. Joe, go ahead.
I respect the time and I love the data. And so I just have a comment about the data, not a direct question to you. As an entity, the CFTC, we think about helping market participants make good decisions. And part of that is having good data. And if you could, a suggestion, access the data, whether that's USDA export inspection data being accurate, The census data that comes out on what's being shipped in and shipped out is sometimes delayed. And then I specifically wanted to highlight shipping vessel logs, not necessarily on the Mississippi, but if you think about, recently the Port of Stockton no longer publishes its daily vessel log, and that they publicly said, and I actually have it on my phone, U.S. Coast Guard assessment of Port of Stockton identified the port's public dissemination of vessel traffic as a risk to homeland security. Now, I understand there's many agencies in this U.S. government, and I don't claim to understand what is a threat to public safety. But for decision-making, we like to track vessels coming in and out and understanding fertilizer coming into Stockton or grain coming into Wilmington or other shipments that are going on. So access to public data, like Susan had, is very important to the decision-making that our hedgers make in these marketplaces, and that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Joe. Mr. Haig.
Tom Haig with the National Corn Growers Association. And Susan, thank you. And my home state is Minnesota. So I'm very dear to the Mississippi. And we could have another thing happen here in 23 again because of the drought and how low we are right now in our state of Minnesota and the flow going down the Mississippi. It's we're already at lower end in Minnesota where I think they're starting to have less filling of barges. They can't fill them as full. So that hurts us for the grain going down, plus also the commodities coming back up our way. But thank you very much, Susan, for your presentation.
Mr. Ricks.
Thank you. Michael Ricks with Cargill. I would just like to make one comment. Thank you, Susan. It's very, very thorough. The competitive markets today is making this situation even more problematic. When the U.S. is the price setter, there's an ability to put some of these added costs on the receiver or the end user. But today, the U.S. and a lot of times is not the primary supplier. It's coming out of South America with expanded production. That means there's little ability to move these costs down the chain, because if we raise our price, FOB U.S. Gulf, then the buyers will just go to Brazil. So what that means is the entire U.S. supply chain has to absorb these costs, which is largely the farmer. It's just a different dynamic today with the competitive situation. Thank you.
Buddy. Thank you. I know we're out of time. Susan, that was fascinating. Thank you for your good report. Jim, you're right. We do have a problem right now. I'm from Memphis, and I confirm your observations. And I would say to a group of advocates and risk managers, infrastructure in our shallow water port network is critical. We're behind on investment in dredging. Our appropriators on the Hill are doing a good job based on what we learned last year and what we're seeing now. So we should put that on our list for advocacy work. It's really important. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, commissioners.
Susan, thank you. That was really incredible. Just a quick question. Have you made any, and you may not have an answer to this, but looking at your charts and the specific weather events that have occurred over the past decade, are there any measurable changes in the way the market reacted, or the way, kind of to Buddy's point, the infrastructure has changed at all such that we can absorb these weather shocks better? Or is it really, every hurricane is different, every weather event is different, you can't control that, but do you get a sense that there are steps being taken, notwithstanding again what Buddy mentioned, to mitigate and absorb some of the shocks as they come?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. And I think, that it is somewhat difficult to compare year over year in analytics, because there are a lot of unique characteristics to these things happening. And while they are fairly frequent, they are still irregular. I think, I would love to give that question some additional thought and perhaps respond to the committee as appropriate. I will say that just from a lay perspective and looking to the response from something like Hurricane Ida, it's pretty remarkable how quickly the industry was able to recover from that. But I think that, in terms of how things have progressed over time, I need to put some more effort into that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was wonderful. I think as people look at forecasting for the future, when you have these spikes and these extreme events, how does that play in when you're looking at past data
Sure, sure. And that's next on our agenda, actually, is to look at the forecasting for how long these events last and how long impacts to markets last. As you know, there's a lot of factors that affect markets, but part of the science and data science is having an objective appreciation of, characterizing things in, like, when you take a data set that's historic to use it for predicting the future, keeping it honest by separating that data set into parts that are for training and parts that are for testing, so that you can take that data set and train it on data, but then leave sight unseen data to prove out the model, on what's actually happening in data it hasn't seen. But that certainly is next on our agenda, is trying to create predictive models for recovery periods for these sorts of things.
Commissioner Mersinger.
Yeah, just real quick, kind of reiterate Buddy's points. I was shaking my head yes when he was talking, because river management, it is a difficult issue as someone who grew up along the river and then worked for a senator from a state where there's a number of interests involved. I think the locks and dam system that, or from the northern part of the river wasn't impacting the section you were looking at, there's a lot of need for improvements. And these systems were put in place to help manage the ups and downs of the river, because that's always been the case. River highs and river lows is not a new thing. But certainly, there is, I guess I would just say there's certainly an important role for the federal government to really take a look at this and understand what needs to be done and where investment needs to be made to help better improve the infrastructure along these rivers, to make sure that there's a better, that we can better manage, the movement of freight down the river. So it's really less of a question, just more of reiterating the point that Buddy made.
Any other questions from the audience? Swati, do you want to have some comments?
Sure. Thank you all for all those questions. So now we're going to hear from Chairman Benham, the AAC sponsor, for his closing remarks.
Very briefly, again, thanks to the commissioners for being here. Great questions. Thanks to the panelists, everyone for coming here in person, and of course, those who are with us virtually. I hope you're able to stick around for the afternoon. It'll be an interesting discussion. And as I said, in my opening remarks, your participation is key in the development of any policy out of this afternoon's discussion. Scott, thank you. Swati, thank you for everything you do. We wouldn't be here without them. I know you guys know that, given the engagement that's been going on over the past couple months. We're going to meet again in December. We're going to try to get together before the holidays. We'll have some more issues to discuss. But as we talked about earlier, if there are matters that are emerging or that you think are sort of prime for the committee to discuss, please let us know. This is what we're here to do. I think today's discussion was important. A few things to take away on the FCM issue and the market access issue. And then Susan, thank you for that. Those are the unique moments that we have to have data-driven analysis from the outside of our little community to see what's going on and what we can do to improve markets, access to markets, and retain U.S. Production and our ability to feed the world. So thanks again for everyone's presence, your participation, your service, and hope again you can stick around. Otherwise, have a great afternoon and summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Benham. Thank you to all the AAC members and guest panelists for your participation at today's meeting. The meeting is now adjourned.